Hello, I'm Anavultus, and welcome to Getting the Answers, here with my wonderful co-host, Wyatt Berckenhoff.
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Wyatt Berckenhoff for the Breakdown with WB.
Okay, and today we're going to just jump right into the action. Last week, we both came up with some political platforms for candidates, just as an intellectual exercise, and we got through a lot of it, but today we're going to finish it up. So we're just going to hop right to it. Okay, so let me just get everything up. There we go. And I believe we went over the segment that I had on rights. So let's go to energy and the environment. So I'll start. To promote affordability and competitiveness in energy, Congress should not supersede the actions of the several states in its policies toward energy. And the second point is to maintain accountability for pollution and environmental destruction. Let each jurisdiction be legally accountable for any reasonably quantifiable damage that are caused toward other jurisdictions, so that all jurisdictions manage themselves in ways that will avoid such events. So, what do you think?
Okay, I think that those are good goals to set, right? Obviously, you can't go over like details over exactly how you want to do it, and you can watch last video to understand why, because I don't think we need to necessarily discuss that point again. But I think that the goals make sense, and I don't think that the goals are too crazy to where it would involve, a mass budget or anything like that necessarily. It seems to be like you're wanting to take a affordable approach to, say, climate change and energy rather than a mass like we need to do things right now in order to fix it.
Yeah, well, the energy approach is an approach that looks at things in a sort of decentralized way, as in different states have different types of energy available to them. And rather than the federal government subsidizing particular types of energy, instead having the states decide what they want to go with, in my opinion, works better. Also, partially because different types of energy have different affordability questions. For example, solar and wind have been relatively unaffordable, but they have become cheaper over the years. Some areas have an important coal industry. Of course, there's also hydroelectric availability. Some people thinking nuclear is very good, going sort of in the direction that France is going. So there's a lot of different options that people have, and I don't want to necessarily lock people into we're going to use this type of energy, even if other types may be better in certain situations.
For sure, yes. You
Yeah.
kind of get to the joke when talking about climate change and the whole debate. Like, you're not going to have, a hydro energy, I forget what the exact term is now, but the source with water in Nevada, where it's desert. You're going to
Well,
have,
yeah,
solar
the
power.
Great Basin. Yeah, that's not
Yeah,
where all the big rivers are. Yeah. On the environmental side, I took an approach, and I didn't know this when I was writing this, but I found out later that somebody else actually had taken a relatively similar approach and won a Nobel Prize for it. So that's interesting. But I'm talking about Eleanor Ostrom, and she won the Nobel Prize in economics for looking at what is called the tragedy of the commons, which can include a number of different things, but in this case, it includes resources that might be limited, and the immediate environment. So, for example, in a certain area, there's only certain number of trees or a certain amount of fish in the rivers, and so the tragedy of the commons occurs when either the government goes in and has to stop people from doing all these things, or the government doesn't do anything, and then people just destroy the environment on their own, or people under a libertarian system, hypothetically speaking, I'm not saying that this is true, this is just a hypothetical, might not want to pay for certain types of infrastructure, and therefore nobody has infrastructure. That's a common anti-libertarian argument, but I'm not saying that that's true. But the particularity here is that this lady went into various small communities in more isolated areas and looked at how they manage their resources, and it was discovered that if resources are managed on a communal level, that people tend to actually have a reasonable idea of the limitedness of their resources, and through social pressure will prevent other people from in their community from wasting their resources. So essentially, the most effective way under this idea to manage the environment and natural resources is to have it managed by communities. And so what I propose then is a robust system, so that if these communities go outside their bounds and damage the resources of another group, let's say you have a poison waste dumping ground and it seeps into the groundwater and poisons people downstream, then they can be sued and they'll be held accountable. And this also, because it's placed on a communal level, this and isn't individualized, it means that the environmentalists who are concerned that individually people wouldn't want to individually people wouldn't be holding themselves accountable, that there is actually some level of regulatory force over this, even if it is very local. And by it being very local, it also means that regulatory overreach can be easily recognized and therefore easily dismantled when it occurs.
Right. Yeah. That definitely makes sense. I mean, we've talked many episodes before where the more local you get, I think the better results, and at least the more likely you're gonna have better results. Uh, the only other counter I could see is with corruption of the local politics, the local leaders, or who's going to oversee it. Because if you have, like you said with the river, where if, they contaminate the water and it goes down, obviously it's easy to tell that they contaminated the water, but who's going to go in and make the punishment, so to speak?
Well, it'll have to be the higher level of government. One community sues the other community, and then the higher level of government, whichever one it is that holds a jurisdiction over that, gets to decide. I think that already exists in some way already. It's just that this is really emphasizing the environmental aspect of it and ensuring that there is that level of accountability.
Right. Accountability is huge, especially for something like the environment.
Yeah, because we live in a society, and I don't want to have the federal government have a totalitarian control over uh, exactly all elements of the environment. So instead, I decide, well, we'll leave it up to the communities so that they can manage their own environment, and if they mess with the environments of others, they'll have to pay up.
Right. Definitely. Yep.
Yeah.
I mean that, like I said, it does make a lot of sense, and it'll be interesting to see what exists now because I'm not too for sure on like policies that exist now, and my head wants to go to like second world and third world countries for this type of solution. Now, obviously, first world nations could fit into it as well, but I don't know. I could just see this as being more of like a United Nations approach to try to solve climate change. Even though I don't know, United Nations is probably a bad example, but I could see this being more of a global approach to try to solve climate change as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose anybody could do this, but it's very decentralized, so I don't think globalists would have a lot to complain about it. Sorry, anti-globalists. I'm sure the globalists do have a lot to complain about, but the anti-globalists probably not as much.
Right.
Yeah, did you have anything on a similar front to that?
I had a category on
Environment.
environment.
There you go.
Yes,
Uh, if you like, you can read it.
of course. So my first point was climate change does exist, but there are not enough alternative energy resources to be effective yet. Therefore, we should focus. Therefore, therefore, there should be focus on finding upgrades of storage. Second point, a committee will be made with more focus on finding a new way to store energy while not adding any more alternative energy, as the money will be spent on research. The third is nuclear power will be used in places where alternative energy is needed instead of any of the others, as it is the most effective and efficient. And that should be so far, but yeah, that was the approach I had to the environment. My theory here is that right now, as alternative energy exists, wind power, solar power, hydropower, nuclear power to some extent, there's only a cap of how much it can produce. We have to use the energy we have pretty much right away with alternative energy. So there's times that let's just use a local example that in Texas the wind power is efficient and it produces more energy than what we can use at that moment. So therefore we are losing energy from it. So it's not that it's that alternative energy is weak in that way, but there's obviously days that wind power doesn't produce enough, and then you get into problems if your energy grid relies on it. And we saw a little bit of that with the apocalypse of the snowstorm, a little bit. Not that that was the direct example. I don't think that alternative energy is 100% to blame, even though our governor blamed it on wind power. But anyway, I'm getting on a side tangent there. But my whole theory here is that if we focus on how to be able to store energy to use for later, I think that we would be better off even with the existing energy we have. And the places that really, really need to have energy, I would suggest nuclear energy because as of right now, it is the most efficient. It is costly to make nuclear power plants if you don't have them, but I would say that it would be a better strategy to make a nuclear plant than to try to do wind power or solar power or hydropower, at least right now.
Yeah, so I see your approach is very much based on a sort of research focused. I suppose mine is more broad, broad field of establishing a system wherein particular things can be addressed by particular people, whereas yours is more specific on the point of what type of power we need right now and what exactly it is that we're missing from some of the renewable sources.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I definitely took a approach of looking at what the problem is now and then saying, well, how do I think that this needs to be fixed? And my only solution I came up with was research. And I kind of explained that the reason I thought research needed to be needed. And when I said research, I'm just to make this clear, I'm saying research in how to store the energy better. Because whoever can make this invention of a battery or whatever their concept is going to be is probably going to have a huge influence of on how alternative energy works. And then people who want alternative energy to be uh, the main energy source could have reasons to do so. But till then, your alternative energy is, well, alternative energy.
Yeah. Or perhaps find a way to hook up a lightning rod to some capacitors, and we can capture that. That'd be interesting. Although currently that's, I think, quite a ways off, technologically speaking. I don't know whether we'll make it there, but we can always hope. That's why people spend money on that. Now, the question of whether we should, the federal government should be spending the money, or whether it should be private corporations or the states or whatever, that's a different question, I would say. But should we move on to the next section?
Yeah, we could move on to the next section.
Okay. My next section is social welfare and education. And I've got 6 points here. Concerning Social Security and other federal programs, the federal government is obligated to fulfill its existing commitments. However, the future of these programs remains fiscally questionable. Therefore, the programs and their associated taxes should be phased out for future generations, while not prohibiting the several states from implementing their own programs. Number 2, concerning unemployment, let each state resolve its own issues in accordance with its own unique economic situation. The voters in the states, not the federal government, are responsible for the accountability of the state governments regarding such policies. Number 3, concerning healthcare, there are many different approaches to this issue, and no complete consensus seems possible. Therefore, it is wise to devolve decision-making on this issue to the states. Number 4, concerning veterans' benefits, the U.S. government is obligated to reward its veterans generously for their service and must avoid neglect, abuse, and corruption. Number 5, to promote competitive education, centralized standards and interventions should be eschewed in favor of state-initiated solutions that allow for community-specific programs and innovative approaches to education. Number 6, concerning federal student, to phase out the federal student loan system and to congressionally explore options for reducing such student loan debt. So, do you have any thoughts in particular, or let me just explain a few of the points here. So, with my idea on Social Security and other federal programs, is of course we know there's questions about the long-term sustainability of Social Security, and other federal programs would include other things such as Medicaid, Medicare, and various programs. And being someone who used to do taxes, I'm familiar that there are taxes specifically associated with these programs. So what I'm saying is that we should be essentially phasing these programs out and allowing the states, if they want to make their own programs that might be better suited to their economic situation and therefore might be more sustainable. And with the unemployment, a similar idea that the states should be able to decide how they want to handle unemployment and how much they would consider it to be a problem. Healthcare, same thing. Veterans benefits, because these people are government employees essentially, and they've done a lot for the country. I think there's no real argument against maintaining their benefits and ensuring, of course, that there's no corruption in the veterans' affairs. And the education, similar to social programs, decentralized there, and student loans. This is something that I seriously thought a lot about because the government did in some ways create the student loan crisis because the government produced a situation wherein it was encouraging people to take student loans and financial institutions to give them, and was also backing student loans as well financially, which led to more people taking student loans and now entering into debt which they currently do not have bankruptcy as a recourse to get out of, and therefore they're a bit trapped in that situation. So there's a number of different proposed solutions. One would be to actually pay off the debt. Another one would be to stop the interest or to allow bankruptcy, and a number of other things. But I think the federal government, at least, should also stop making these loans, and if the states want to, they can come in with their own replacements.
Definitely. Once again, I think you're very consistent in the approach you have, which I like. I don't really see bouncing around in between ideas. It's like for lack of better words, more of a not necessarily philosophical approach, but I think you kind of get what I'm saying.
Yeah,
But I think, uh huh,
I take some fundamental principles and then I apply them broadly.
right, yes, yeah. I think that with the unemployment and Social Security, your first 2 points, uh, they are in a large part. Well, the first one in a large part is a federal program, obviously. Uh, so if you want to get rid of them per se, and how would you go about replacing it, or would you let the states decide on what replaces it and make it more of a decentralized approach?
Yes, I would make it a more decentralized approach. I think, of course, this would have to be discussed in committee in Congress. So obviously, there's multiple opinions that will go into this. But generally speaking, what I would imagine would happen if this were to be popular is that the existing commitments that are made due to people already paying into the system would be maintained. New people coming up would not be able to enter into the system. And also, the existing infrastructure for these systems can either be sold to the state or given to the state. There's probably a number of different approaches, or just liquidated by the federal government. And if the existing infrastructure for the Social Security Administration is given to the states, then it also preserves the jobs of the people that are in that infrastructure. Of course, if the states choose not to have that, then they'll probably have to find different jobs. But of course, that's true for any federal program. If you have to collapse it, that there's people in the program working on the program, and of course, the federal side of things wouldn't cease to exist because people still have federal commitments that they receive, so that would still be existing for some time. Now, it could be that those commitments may be transferred over to the states, and then the states might be able to decide whether or not they want to have transferable commitments to other states, or whether people have a particular program from a state that they can still receive in a different state. So it'll be a lot of it will have to happen on a state level as well. But it all depends on what they want and what they consider to be a workable system.
Right. Yeah. I figured that that was going to be your answer to that question. I just wanted to make sure I understood your theory, I guess, on your first point. Your second and third points make sense to me. I don't really have any comments to say on those because I think that those are the best ways to go about the situation. Your first point with the veterans, would you say that you want a state approach for better, say, veteran benefits,
Um,
or once again a more federal, like what's the system called? V.
the VA, veterans, if someone's part of the National Guard, which belong to the states, then that makes sense. But and I think it's already that way anyway. As far as I'm aware, I don't know if the federal government gives benefits to members of the National Guard. I'd have to check on that. I don't actually know that. But these people are the U.S. military, and therefore they get U.S. government benefits. I don't think it makes sense to decentralize that part.
Right, right, yeah, yeah. I don't have a. Well, I guess I do have a second question. And this isn't really what you have in your point, more just a extension of a question. But do you think that the VA would have to be addressed as, say, a sub point of this? Because some veterans have problems with how the VA handles benefits.
Yeah, obviously, VA reform is something that a lot of people have looked into. For example, I think in the Trump administration, there were some VA reforms, and a lot of people were happier. At least that's what I've heard. I don't know exactly what the situation is on the ground. I'm not a veteran, so I'm not in direct contact with this situation. If there are problems in veterans affairs, then in my view, it makes sense to address those problems in the government. So if there's corruption, then there need to be mechanisms for that corruption to be dealt with. If there's some malfeasance somewhere, then justice needs to be handled there. I know that there's a lot of homeless veterans, at least in the area where I live, and I don't know whether that has anything to do with the VA or not, or it could also be other situations. But always looking into the situation of the veterans is important on the VA side of things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The homeless veterans is a pretty common problem. And I've watched a video recently on the VA, and that's why I brought that up. But I don't think we ultimately need to necessarily talk about that. But I do think that the VA does need to be reformed a little bit. Your fifth and sixth points about education and student loans. Uh, I think that the whole student loan problem is pretty big, and I do think you're right about the government being at least partially responsible. I don't think you could say that they're fully responsible for the student loan crisis. Um, I guess I would ask: are you planning to, when you say, I think you were saying phase out, yeah, phase out the federal student loan system? How long? And obviously, this would be up to committees most likely to come up
Yeah.
with a time. But like, I guess I'm just asking, what do you think is realistically possible?
Realistically possible, as in how much time it would take, or
Yeah, how much time it would take? Yeah.
well, theoretically speaking, it could happen today. The federal government could sign a bill into law and it goes, but obviously it's not that fast. Any government solution, or to be more exact, any legislative solution, will necessarily take time. Now, if it is a very popular bill, what can happen is that Congress can actually petition for it to skip committees, and therefore immediately go on the floor to a vote. That's something that can happen, according to the House rules, anyway. So, in theory, it can go through relatively quickly in that sense. But it all depends on how Congress works. And the question of how long a bill stays in committee is really a question that's unanswerable because some bills stay there for a very, very long time, some stay there for a very short time.
Right. Yeah, that's a definitely a tough question to answer. And like you mentioned before, most of this would have to go to committees because this isn't a full plan like you are president. And we discussed that on the
Well,
first
even
episode.
if I were
But,
president, then I wouldn't be able to do these things by myself anyway. I'd still have to have the
right.
legislature.
Right. Yeah, we're right. I would hope so. Yeah, at least. I don't think we've gone that far downhill since.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I
anyways.
am the Senate.
Yeah. Yeah, if that day happens, we might be having some problems.
Well, don't worry. If it's me in charge, no, I'm joking, of course.
Yeah. Da, da, da. Yeah, I think that I don't really have a question on the other points necessarily. So
Yeah.
I
Do
do
you,
have. No, sorry. Go on.
uh, oh yeah, you were going to say something.
I was going to say I do have a topic on education
Okay.
on mine. Let me
Okay.
scroll up here. Okay. I say with my first point, public education is lacking for a first world nation when compared to other countries such as Finland. The first step is to make standards of education we have better. Second point, public education, the way it is now, works for some students while doesn't work for all students. And this could also be said for private school. Having one standard of education from a mass state levels leaves for many holes, excuse me. These holes can be fixed by making education more personalized, even more than just the state level. Three, education schools should be divided into categories that allow the students to pick what they are good at and become experts at it. A school for math, a school for science, a school for art, and others. If a student is unclear, they can go to a general public school that has all the areas of needs. The fourth, the standards of the school will be made by the area and the state where the school is in, but there will be tips given out by the education committee, including if a student goes to art school, there will be 4 hours of art and 1 to 2 hours of general education. This is just a example. The general still needs to be there to grasp basic concepts needed, such as math in this example. So I'll go scroll back up. My first point is kind of an introduction of the topic. I think I've done an introduction on everyone just to kind of state how I think about the situation. So we've talked about education on a previous episode, and yeah, that's just kind of the first point. My second point is basically the idea that right now, as public education exists now, there are very few students that it's fully efficient with. Very few students come out of public school as hardcore experts, to use a word. It leaves a lot of gaps in how we have it. Third point is my idea of splitting things into categories of schools. So you could say like we have trade schools now
Yeah.
where you could go be a welder, plumber, electrician, all those type of mechanic, those type of jobs or
Yeah.
fields.
Or more in the
My idea,
old fashioned sense, you had grammar schools and rhetoric schools and things like that.
right. My idea is making specialized general education schools. So I mentioned public school or private schools up at I think it was the second point. I just used it as an example that even private schools don't work for everyone. But as a government, you're not going to be able to necessarily fix private schools because, well, they are private. And even at a state level, there's rules that private schools exist in. But I'm not really talking about private schools. I just wanted to make that clear. So with the general education schools, my idea is well, making them a school specialized in a subject. And I decided that there was going to have to be at least a little bit of, in my idea at least, a little bit of general education hours, because if you're a student that is wants to do art, I don't think that you would be able to do art for 7 hours a day for 5 days and be able to go into the ward and be efficient in basic things. So I do think that math and science and those type of subjects are needed, but I don't think that they're needed in the way that we have it now. Yeah, so that's kind of my approach for that. But I think that everything, as I mentioned, would be left up to the state. So if the state decided that we're just going to have 7 hours of art or 7 hours of math, if it's a math school, then that's what it would be. So I'm kind of a fan of the state approach for education as well. And yeah, that was basically what I had for my points. I don't know if you had any questions about those.
Well, I think the real question that the states would have is probably how are they going to afford having different kinds of schools? Because already they have at least one general school in each jurisdiction. So having different kinds would they would have to spread them out in a different way probably. They might have to convert existing general schools to specialized schools, and then they would have to gather students from a larger area to make a student body, both in the general schools and the specialized schools as well. So
Right.
there's obviously logistical questions and also questions of cost effectiveness. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against the idea. I think having specialized schools is a good thing. It's just that the question will be among the states whether they're actually going to go for this or whether they're just going to keep the system that they already have.
Right, yeah, for sure. And I did think about many of those, I guess you could say, issues that I have with my points. Because the example that came to mind, obviously, I live in Texas and I go to school in a pretty country area. It's still pretty populated because it is a college town, but if you go to the next county over, there's not that many people there. And so the idea that, somebody from that county is going to be interested in, just to do stereotypes, art or something, is probably very unlikely. They're probably going to be more interested in math, maybe as for an engineer or for farming if they're in a farming family, yeah, agriculture, stuff like that. So this system is, in a way, you can't have every specialized school for every county. You can't have, 7 schools for every, jurisdiction or every ISD, because Texas uses ISDs, independent school districts. So this system
Yeah,
as it exists right now on paper, I think could only work for places that are highly populated and probably cities,
yeah,
most likely.
or perhaps less busing, more boarding schools. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see what Kamala Harris thinks about that.
Yeah,
Now, so obviously there are issues with it, and that's I spent some time thinking about how I would address those. And I don't think it's as simple as dividing the school that exists now into a math section, a science section, an art section. I don't think that that would work either, because I don't think you're going to have even numbers of people that are in each field. You're not going to have, 1,000 science people, 1,000 math people, 1,000 art people. That would be a big school, but I'm just using numbers here. You're not going to have everybody split even. So I don't think that that's a solution either. So it would have to involve, most likely, more schools being made. And a lot of counties are making more schools now, but that's very costly. And if they were to invest in this policy and have to make 2, 3 more schools, there could be issues. So I do realize that this may not work for every state or
Yeah.
every district.
We'll just say it's something that they'll decide in state committee.
Yes.
Okay, so my next section is foreign policy, and you also have a foreign policy section as well, but I'll go over mine first since that's the turns that we are taking. So, foreign policy. Number one, to affirm American sovereignty, the United States of America must not enter into any political union or treaty that prejudices or abridges the rights of the American people, the rights of the several states, or the lawful functions of our federal government. Number two, to affirm the reality of international relations, the United States of America should formally recognize all countries that hold uncontested control over their own territories, prioritize its own interests first, and conduct itself responsibly in light of its international hegemony. Number three, to maintain honorable relations with other countries, the United States of America should act with reciprocity in its policies and not engage in any subversive or covert activities in any country with which we are not officially at war. Number four, concerning legal immigration. Immigrants should be admitted if they have no outstanding legal disputes, no affiliation with the enemies of our country, and a locale in our country that is willing to permit them residence. Those who have outstanding legal disputes are affiliated with an enemy of the United States or have no locale that is willing to permit them residence may not be admitted into our country for permanent residence or citizenship. Refugees should be accepted on a case-by-case basis if they did not have to pass through other countries to enter ours. Their status as refugees is warranted, and a locale is willing to permit them residence. Number five, concerning illegal immigration. Any person who unlawfully violates the territorial integrity of the United States should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Those who have otherwise conducted themselves lawfully while escaping the just punishment for their unlawful migration must make the choice between paying a heavy fine and being naturalized or returning to their home countries, only being able to immigrate upon payment of the fine. Future illegal immigration should be dealt with using the second option. Number six, concerning foreign aid. Foreign economic aid should be given privately at the initiative of citizens or corporations unless strategic utility demands that the intervention of our government is absolutely necessary. Military aid should be given if it is necessary and in proportion to the strategic utility that the country receiving the aid affords to the United States. Efforts should be made to regularly examine the real necessity and real benefit of foreign aid to reduce unnecessary spending. Concerning border security, any region of the border that is known to be used in illegal crossings should be defended with lethal force so that any reasonable, well-intentioned person fearing for his own safety will use official legal crossing points, reducing the number of deaths from illegal crossings in the wilderness. Should violence repeatedly and excessively cross over our borders from other countries, the United States of America should be ready to resolve the issue at its source in whatever country is unable to contain its own malefactors. Number 8, concerning the People's Republic of China, the United States of America should be ready to respond to any hostility to itself or its allies, including the Republic of China, Taiwan, in what can be recognized as today's Cold War. Number 9, concerning the Russian Federation, the United States of America is not presently threatened by this country and should seek more amicable relations with Russia for our common strategic interests while retaining American allies in Western Europe. So that was a bit of a long one. Do you have any particular questions?
I'll make a, I guess you could say a joke for the last point, and then I do have a question. I don't know if Biden would necessarily agree with you on point number 9, but I don't think that that's necessarily a big problem. uh, the whole Russia thing is just crazy to me. Anyway, where was the question I had? Yeah, here we go. So with your illegal immigration point number 5, uh, any person who unlawfully violates the territorial integrity of the United States should be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Is so when you say fullest extent of the law, what exactly do you mean by that phrase?
Well, they violated our border, which means that they broke our law. In that case, it would be a trial in the United States. And the punishment would be whatever punishment Congress sees fit for it. But what I am also emphasizing here is that they should be prosecuted, and that federal prosecutors should not avoid prosecuting these people, and also that we shouldn't allow sanctuary cities. That would be a natural extent of this. If they are being punished to the fullest extent of the law, then that means that if a town decides that they aren't going to report this, they're not going to enforce the laws, then that is at the very least, a misprision of felony, which is a federal crime, which is when somebody commits a felony, but somebody who witnesses the felony and knows it's a felony and could have reported the felony chooses not to do so, and that's a crime.
Right. Uh, we've definitely discussed that concept before, and the 7th point is kind of related to it. And I don't really have a question necessarily on the 7th point. I just thought I would highlight that one about the border security, and that all of the border needs to be secure. So I would assume that you would resume the construction. But yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm entirely liking the idea of a wall. To be honest, I think I use the terms lethal force, and to a lot of people that's very scary. But I explain in that comment why I think it would actually reduce the number of people that die at the border if they know that there's somebody standing on the other side with lethal force. Also, if you're doing lethal force, having a solid wall, you can't really see who's trying to cross. So it's actually harder to watch the border if there's a big wall there. So I think having a fence would probably be better. In that sense, it's also probably a lot cheaper. Of course, there is the expense of having people at the border. So that's where the expense comes back in again. But I think that if people know that there's somebody on the other side who would shoot them with live ammo if they try to cross illegally, they would avoid crossing, except for crossing at legal points. In which case, you still have the problem of people overstaying their visas or being smuggled in a vehicle or something. But at least it would reduce the number of people trying to cross in the wilderness, who might die from the elements anyway. So I think that's something, because somebody who knows that there's somebody who might shoot them is going to have the wherewithal to avoid crossing at such a location.
Mm-hmm. I guess the only counterpoint I have, and I don't even know if it's really that big of a counterpoint here, but you would think that they could potentially already be scared of lethal force, but that being said, a lot of the border isn't really secured. Even the parts that have wall so far, the border's kind of a mess when it comes to that. And recently, a lot of border patrol has been called back to the border because there was a lot of people who were doing jobs in border security but not at the border. So I think that they're trying to, at least an appearance of trying to beef it up a little bit more. But I can definitely see your point, and I definitely think that it would deter a good percentage of people. You can't say all because I don't think it would deter all, but a good percentage of people. And I also like the point of spending more money on border patrol than spending more money on the wall because we've seen how they're able to get past the wall through tunnels or break through the wall or go through parts that don't have a wall. So I do think that if you have a fence, you're still having the wall to deteriorate the people that would be afraid of a wall because a fence is basically a wall, not completely, but you still deter those people. But you're still going to have the people that are inventive, or however to pronounce the word, and they're able to dig tunnels through. So you still have the same issues. So I do like the idea of spending more money on border patrol than the wall itself.
Yeah.
I guess we can bounce over to the foreign policy that I have here.
Okay.
So my first point is pull all troops out as fast as possible. There's no reason to be involved and make the areas we are in worse. To rearrange agreements with allies in order to pull troops where a treaty or agreement was made. The goal being to provide support for new, more extreme cases instead of why the troops are there now. 3. Foreign aid needs to be reduced and new agreements need to be made. It's important to get allies happy and stable, but the aid amount needs to be reduced. For military aid, it should be done when only absolutely necessary within a new agreement made, or keeping stable of nations and allies. 4. Legal immigration. The test to become a citizen of the United States should be held at a high standard. The immigrant should also have to go through a background check and have no violent criminal history. For refugees and people seeking safety, the check will remain the same on a one by one basis. This might make the process slower, but keeping the border safe and the citizens safe is the number one concern. 5. Illegal immigration is not tolerated. If someone is caught or found later by ICE, they should be sent back to the home country unless a further act was done. And when I say further act, I mean either, well, I'll finish it and then talk about it. When a further act was done. In order to do so, before being sent back, there would be an investigation and, if needed, a trial if a criminal act was done. So, and when I say, this is what I was going to talk about. When I say a criminal act, it could be anything from a civil type of event to a criminal event, like, say, a robbery, or in the worst case, like a murder or a rape or something like that. So, obviously, if a murder or rape is done, then they would seek a criminal lawsuit. But I'm even talking about minor things in that situation. So, in a way, for my fifth point, I'm basically saying that before they're sent back, I think there needs to be an investigation to be able to determine how they got through and if any criminal act was committed inside the United States, besides obviously crossing the border illegally. The
Yeah.
fourth point I have reads a lot like what we already have now, and it kind of is, except I'm wanting to reduce more refugees going into the United States, and I think that the process at least needs to be slower to prevent gaps that exist now. Third one about foreign aid. Really, the first or 2 and 3 points is my whole strategy here is I don't think that we're going to be able to reduce all foreign aid. I don't think that that would be possible. I'm not an expert in foreign policy by any means, but I just don't see how that would be possible. So my idea here is to renegotiate with all of the nations to come up with different numbers. I don't think that we're going to be able to just simply pull out when it comes to foreign aid and military aid to, say, Israel. We talked about that in a recent episode, and I think that's the most recent example of military aid going to a country. So I think that the only time military aid should be going to a country is if they're in war. I don't think that any other instance of military aid should be needed.
Yeah. Well, what if I think something that's very important about war is that a lot of war is not about the war itself, a lot of military spending. It's also about deterrence.
Hmm.
So when you, and that's also why US troops are in a lot of different places. So when you say you want to pull troops out, do you want to pull troops out of places like Japan, where they're positioned strategically close to North Korea and China?
I would. I don't think that you would be able to pull those troops out. I probably should have been more specific in the troops I'm wanting to pull out. I'm more talking about like the long time wars. Like I think if I'm not mistaken, troops are in. Is it Afghanistan now? I think it's
Yeah,
Afghanistan. I'm more talking about pulling troops like that off, not troops that, like you mentioned, are in strategic locations. Now you could say that troops in Afghanistan are strategic, but I don't think that that really is the case anymore. So I think that in a way it would have to be done by a one by one basis, but I'm saying that we don't need all the troops we have overseas to be overseas.
yeah, and that's currently happening in Afghanistan. That troops are being pulled out as agreements have been made with the Taliban. I would suppose, of course, there's also anti-piracy operations, and those protect U.S. shipping. So I think and have been done from very early in the history of our country. I would suppose that that also would not be included under the troops you'd want to pull out.
Yeah, I don't think that that would be included either. I would have to look more into it, but I think that stuff that's crucial to shipping or crucial to reducing possible war is important. I don't think that being in Afghanistan is important.
Yeah. So I take a more aggressive approach towards China, where I'm not saying that we're going to war, but I am saying that we acknowledge that there is a bit of a Cold War going on, and also that we should be protecting Taiwan.
Hmm. Yeah, I didn't have anything on Pacific nations, and I kind of decided not to. I did at one point have it, but I don't think I know enough to write about what we should do in, say, China or what we should do in Russia or any other nation. So that's why I decided not to include it. But I do think that China does need to be addressed in a good foreign policy. And I have many people, when I've done streams, mention the fact that they think China is going to become the new, world power because the US dollar is decreasing at a huge rate and many other points they bring up. So there seems to be a lot of interest in the perception of China increasing despite all the COVID stuff and the decrease of the United States perception. I don't know if that's true or not, but that just seems to be what I've heard from people.
Yeah, I hear that the most likely route of expansion for China is over land, and that the naval expansion is partially to protect its trade, and therefore to replace a lot of the stuff the U.S. is doing in places like the Indian Ocean. although a lot of their ships are actually more river oriented and close to coast oriented. So they don't really have as large of an ocean going fleet as the US has, even though China has a very large fleet. So I think a lot of it is very defensive. But of course, they are jamming up places upriver from India. They are looking into various areas to make purchases. Now the question is, can Chinese expansion outpace their economic problems, because they are entering into economic problems? But anyway, that's something probably for another time, and I think we've talked about it a little bit before anyway. So anyway, the last point I would say is on immigration. I focus on the idea that if people are coming to this country, they need a place to come to, and that the particular benefit of them coming would then be decided based on who is sponsoring them coming into the country. You take a more specific approach on doing tests and various things.
Right. I don't think that tests are fully efficient. I do say that I think there are problems with it, but I don't necessarily think that you would be able to slow the border enough to do a case by case basis. I don't think that would be able to happen. Now, if is it a better approach? Maybe. I don't necessarily think that it is a bad approach. I just don't know if you would be able to convince Congress or the Senate to be able to slow it. So I was more approaching it from trying to maybe make the test better and enforcing it more.
Okay, so anyway, I shall move on to my next section here. And that is additional reforms. So this is miscellaneous things. A lot of them are constitutional reforms. One, to obtain a greater clarity concerning the powers of the federal government, the Elastic Clause and the Commerce Clause should be granted greater specificity through constitutional amendation. So this is referring to a couple of clauses in the Constitution. The Elastic Clause, which allows the president to do a wide number of things, and the Commerce Clause, which allows the federal government to manage the interaction between states, at least in regards to commerce, but which has been interpreted as to expanding to a number of other different things. So I want an amendment to make these things more specific so that there's less potential of corruption, and so that people will actually know where exactly things should stand. Number two, to affirm the rights of the several states, the reserved powers of the states should be described more definitively and unambiguously in a constitutional amendment so that Congress may be better accountable for when it oversteps its authority. This is straightforward. According to, I believe it's the 10th Amendment, any powers not granted to Congress are reserved to the states or the people. But I think that because of the Elastic Clause and the Commerce Clause, the exact application of what exactly these reserved powers are has become diluted over time. So if it were to be more specific, we would actually have a better chance of protecting states' rights if we actually define them more strictly. Even if the strictness is broad definitions, it would be better than having no definitions, I would say. Number three, to return the power of legislation to the legislatures, the legal doctrine of stare decisis must be constitutionally outlawed so that statutory law is protected and the courts restrain themselves to the case at hand. Essentially, this abolishes case law and moves to a full statutory system. And I think we've talked about my problems with case law earlier in previous shows. Number 4, to promote judgments based on evidence, all verdicts should be constitutionally required to include the particular evidences which are agreed upon to show that the defendant is proven guilty, has insufficient evidence against him, or is exonerated. This is of particular use in appeals. So essentially, whenever a jury makes a verdict, they should also include the evidence that they are basing the verdict on. And so in not guilty, therefore, there are 2 subcategories. One is simply not guilty, so that there's insufficient evidence to prove it, and the other one is exonerated, where the jury considers that the evidence that does exist shows that it's not actually possible for the defendant to have committed the crime at all. Both of these would have equal legal meaning. However, in the case of appeals and potential retrials, these are important to show exactly where the court was and what exactly the court had found, which I think is very important to have. So that if somebody is proven guilty based on a particular evidence, and then it's proven that the evidence is false, then the evidence based on which a person was proven guilty, having been annulled, that person therefore should be considered not guilty in the appeal. And I've heard of cases where this has happened, where some evidence has been that was originally very important in deciding the case had later been discarded, but the jury didn't change its decision. And so if evidence is discarded for some reason and they would maintain the guilt of a defendant, they should provide more evidence as to why the defendant is guilty. Number 5, to restore the representation of the state legislatures in the federal government, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution must be repealed. Essentially, this means that senators would be elected by the state legislatures instead of directly by the people. And I think that this is actually very important in balancing the federal government and in ensuring states' rights are protected and to prevent federal overreach. However, people have questioned this as a potential for corruption, and that was the reason why they previously had made the 17th Amendment in the first place. So number 6, to ensure that all qualified persons may be permitted to be elected to the office of a President of the United States, the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution must be repealed. Essentially, this removes the number of terms that a president is limited to run. This removes that, because I think if somebody is a good president, I would want to re-elect the president, even if it's already been that president's second term. Number 7, to enforce the accountability of congressmen, all words spoken on the House floor or Senate floor should be treated as words spoken under oath under penalty of perjury. Essentially to keep congressmen accountable so that they can't just lie in Congress, as has happened. And 8, to maintain the integrity of federal offices, it is necessary to treat any perjury, insurrection, bribery, or forgery that occurs among congressmen, ambassadors, cabinet members, Supreme Court justices, and other heads of federal agencies with the same severity and consequences as treason. Essentially, that opens up the possibility of the death penalty, not necessarily the death penalty, but it ensures that there are severe punishments for various types of corruption that can occur in federal offices. And this is where I would say this balances out the complaints people had against the senators, is that if they are taking bribes, if there is an exchange of money going on behind the scenes, that that can be dealt with if a law is made so that such crimes are in equal severity to treason, in which case they would not have immunity from prosecution to those crimes because of the severity of the crimes.
Right. So your whole points here to sum it up, or at least the approach I think you have is to reduce corruption between all levels of the justice system, the government, and so on. That's kind of the gist. Is that the right approach and what I'm thinking? Or
Yeah, it's to reduce corruption. It's also to make some constitutional reforms where I see parts of a government that aren't working as well as they could be or that are compromised in various ways. And by introducing standards requiring jurors to put forward the particular evidences for a conviction, that also, in my view, increases the reliability of the justice system and prevents a large number of potential false convictions.
for sure. And you mentioned the fifth point in your idea that that could lead to corruption. Frankly, I don't think that that would be possible because, frankly, if you have if you have Republican senators or congressmen or whatever, and they're the ones that get to elect the legislator, the person's probably going to be Republican. And if you look at the history of how legislators get voted in states where they get voted, right, they're most likely going to be Republican. Or, and you could flip it over to Democrat and blah blah blah. So I don't really think that you're going to get different members. Now, could you get
Well, that's
a
not what I
different?
mean by corruption.
Okay, well, what? Okay,
The
but
corruption, okay, and this is based on the actual arguments that were made when that amendment was put into the Constitution. The actual complaints were that it was an insiders club where politicians did insider dealings and people would buy the office, which would, in my view, be seen as taking a bribe and therefore would count as corruption under the last point. That would be harshly punished, and that's why the last point is very important. It's so that the complaints that people had about the amendment, about the need for the amendment, can be addressed, because this was an actual complaint people had, and the actual reasons why people put that into the Constitution.
yeah, I definitely see what you're saying now. Um, your other points about holding senators, congressmen, government officials accountable for what they say, uh, I think that that's a good thing to enforce. Like you say, to enforce the accountability of congressmen is what you said, and then to maintain the integrity of federal offices. I think that 7 and 8 are things that we should achieve more to do, and I don't really see any weakness to those points.
Yeah, because currently in a Senate hearing or in a House hearing or whatever is happening, if there's somebody who's being heard, that person takes an oath uh, and has to speak under oath, but the actual people, the committee, whichever it is, that is presiding over that, actually isn't under oath. And I think that they should be under oath, partially because of their high office, and also to ensure that the government has a good sense of integrity. Because I don't want people in the House floor to just start lying about random stuff. Now, that being said, fact checkers could probably look through that, but I don't want to enter into a situation where somebody is arguing in favor of a bill and then puts out some raw lies in order to get people to vote for the bill.
Uh, yeah. I mean, I definitely see that point, and my head's just thinking of how that could be enforced, but I don't necessarily think that that is super hard to enforce because you see it with regular people. If they, let's just use a court example. If they take an oath to give their testimony and they lie in front of Congress or in front of a court, there could be considered to be perjury. I think I
Perjury.
butchered that. Perjury, yeah. You get what I'm saying. So I think that you could do that same concept, like you pretty much just mentioned, with government officials. So I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that that would be hard to enforce. So I like those points.
Yeah. So in this view, they would essentially be under oath from their oath of office for whenever they're on the House floor or the Senate floor, and they don't have to take it each time they enter that, because it'd be very inconvenient if they had to. So instead, I say that it's just a responsibility that they have.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That would get very tedious if they had to say the oath every time.
Yeah, I think we already went over your justice reform.
Yes, we did that on the first episode.
Yeah, and I think we've covered all of your categories.
I believe we have as well. Yes.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go to the personal commitments I have at the end. Or yeah, we already went over your introduction as well. So I guess because I wrote
Can
more,
you-
I guess I have more to go over. So here we go.
yeah.
Personal commitments. Number one, I commit to political realism in my understanding of policies and their impacts. Now, what political realism is essentially means that I oppose idealism, and therefore, rather than being guided on how I want things to be, I instead try to look at how things are. And one of these important realistic elements is the understanding of power dynamics, that various policies have power behind them. You have to follow the money trail whenever there's a policy. There's all that stuff. I'm sure people can look up realism on their own time. Number two, I commit to examine all legislation with a focus of respecting and upholding the Constitution. This is something that should be a given if somebody's running for Congress. But unfortunately, I think it's something that's important enough to state. Number three, I commit to not voting in favor of any bill that I have not read or understood in its entirety. So that means if there's a bill on the House floor, I would not be able to vote for it because until I have read it and understood it. And I think this was a big problem with the Affordable Care Act, that it was so long that a lot of people hadn't read it by the time it passed, interestingly. They were just encouraged to vote for it, but there wasn't really a lot of time given. Number four, I commit to streamlining the government to be more efficient and reducing legislative bloat in the U.S. Code. Essentially, that means that the U.S. Code is getting bigger by the year. I think it's important to consolidate a number of different laws so that we have a streamlined legal code that is not constantly getting bloated with unnecessary extras. Number five, I commit to cooperate with my colleagues to form an effective government without compromising on my fundamental values. So I think it's very important to understand that people in Congress, they make a lot of speeches about what they want to do, but in the end, they have to rely on others to get things done, both in working together with other congressmen, working together with the other branches of government, and working together with secretaries, aides, various people. So in that sense, cooperation is important, but when you're cooperating, you should still have some principles that you hold before cooperation, on things that you will not compromise. And I think that's very important to make. Otherwise, you can go any direction. And I don't think that that's a very desirable quality for a politician, to be able to just choose any policy and favor literally any policy.
Right. I think that's should be with any political party, any political person. That's something I've always. Okay, let's put it this way: when a president runs on their political platform, they're very rarely they stick to everything that's in their political platform, and a lot of times that's to do with compromising, which I think is important. But I also think that you should stick to your some of your values that you find to be your biggest points. You know, you could say that Trump did that a little bit, but I don't know. I don't think we need to necessarily get into that debate. But I forget the president who it is, but he's considered to be the only president that stuck to all of what his party platform was, or what he ran under.
Yeah.
For your where was it? I don't know why I can't find it now. But when you mentioned that you would not vote, oh, here it is. That you have, okay, let me just read it again. I commit to not voting in favor of any bill that I have not read or understood in its entirety. When you have that point, are you saying read it yourself, or are you saying like your staffers or your secretary read it and give you notes? Because I know that in politics, a lot of times you don't have a lot of time to read bills.
Well, it means that I actually have to read it myself.
Okay,
So if all the bills are too long, then none of the bills are getting my votes. It's as simple as that.
right.
So if they want to push a vote on a bill and it's War and Peace, it's the size of the entire combined Library of Congress, and I can't get it done, then it's simply not getting a vote from me. Now, that being said, I can actually read and comprehend quite quickly on books that it takes some people quite a lot longer to read. So in that sense, personally, that's not too big of a problem for me. But I can but I think it's something that all congressmen should do, and it also, if there's an understanding that people simply aren't going to vote for excessively large bills, then people will be less likely to make excessively large bills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't really see. I was hoping that that would be your answer. Let me just put it that way. Because I have a big problem with the concept of just having staffers read it. And the first time I heard it was to do with the Supreme Court, where they would have staffers give them summaries of cases and whatnot. And maybe that's because they're having to deal with past lawsuits and there's potentially a lot more information. But to me, I have a problem with not being able to exactly understand yourself what what is inside a bill or what is inside a case or whatever the example is. So
Yeah, and we've done a bill on here before. I think it was on our gun control episode. Uh, we had a bill, and it took us about an hour and a half to go through it. So, and that was a whole bill. So in that sense, there are bills that can be read. I think a lot of people overestimate the number of bills that are like the Affordable Care Act, bills that are a thick book. I think most bills aren't that long, although there aren't single page bills nowadays. To wish for that day. But still, I think that if people want to make long bills, they should instead make multiple pieces of legislation and stop pork barreling.
I'm definitely for that opinion. In your other points make sense to me. I don't have any issues with that, and the fourth one especially. And you just were talking about that, so I don't think I have anything else to add on that.
Yep. So, I guess we did it. We went through it all.
Only 2 episodes.
Yeah. Okay, I guess next time we were thinking about talking about third parties and potential successes and failures of third parties. Of course, for people who wanted to watch the previous episode, that's on your channel. For those who want to watch the next episode, that will also be on your channel. So be sure to tune into that. Thank you all for watching, our beautiful audience. Of course, as always, if you have anything to ask, please do ask.
Yes, we definitely read all your comments, and we're definitely willing to do a topic suggestion or anything like that if you want to leave that in the comments as well. And we'll catch you on the next one.
Okay.